On December 4th, 1872, a British merchant ship was crossing the Atlantic when its crew noticed another vessel ahead. The ship was the Mary Celeste, an American brigantine that had been traveling from New York towards Genoa. Something about its movements caught their attention. Their sails were set, but their vessel wasn't maintaining a proper course. From a distance, it was difficult to tell whether the crew was struggling with their ship or whether something more serious had happened. The sailors of the Del Grata tried to make contact, but they got no answer. They called out, nothing. Eventually, a boarding party was sent across. The first thing they discovered was the absence of the crew. There was nobody at the wheel, nobody working on the deck, and nobody below. The ship had completely been left unattended. That alone would have been remarkable. What had made the situation extraordinary was the condition that the Mary Celeste had been found in. There had been no catastrophic accident. The vessel was completely capable of sailing, its cargo remained in the hold, supplies were available, the belongings of those who had been living aboard had been largely left behind. Yet the people themselves had just disappeared. 10 people had left New York aboard the ship less than a month earlier. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs had traveled with his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia. Several other men had joined them as a crew. Not one of them was ever seen again. The lifeboat was missing. That was the first indication the people aboard the deck hadn't simply vanished. At some point they had made the decision to leave. The mystery was figuring out what had persuaded them to do it. Benjamin Briggs was an experienced mariner born into a family connected to the sea. He had spent much of his adult life working aboard the ships. By age 37, he was an established captain with enough experience to understand the dangers of an Atlantic crossing. This was not supposed to be an especially unusual voyage. The Mary Celeste left New York on November 7th, carrying a commercial cargo bound for Italy. Briggs had decided to bring his family along, which suggests that he had no reason to expect anything beyond ordinary difficulties from a long sea journey. His wife Sarah joined him along with their young daughter. The remaining passengers were members of the crew, men whose job was to help navigate and operate the vessel during crossing. There were 10 people in all. For several weeks, everything appears to have gone according to plan. The ship continued eastward. Then, on November 25th, Briggs had made what would become his final entry in the ship's log. The Mary Celeste was still at sea, somewhere between North America and Europe. The captain was alive, his family was alive, and the crew was alive. After that point, the evidence became much thinner. There were no surviving witnesses to describe the final days. The reliable account comes from the people who found the ship, but by then everyone was gone. The interesting clues was hidden below the deck. The Mary Celeste was carrying more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. When the ship was later inspected, several of those barrels were found to have leaked. That matters because alcohol vapor is highly flammable. If fumes had accumulated in the enclosed part of the ship, the crew might have feared a fire or explosion. The situation could have been especially frightening if there had been a sudden release of vapors or a loud sound from the cargo hold. There is no convincing evidence that a major explosion had occurred. A captain faced with the possibility of an explosion would have to make a decision before knowing whether the danger was real. The ship also showed signs that water had entered the vessel. Again, the amount was not considered enough to explain why the Mary Celeste was abandoned at sea. Perhaps perception matters, though. A captain who believes his ship is sinking has to act before it's too late. Briggs may, therefore, have been dealing with two separate concerns at once, and the possibility of dangerous fumes below deck, and the uncertainty about the amount of water entering the hull. Neither problem alone necessarily required abandoning the ship. Together, they may have been enough to convince him that everyone should get off temporarily. Though there was one problem with that decision. The Atlantic Ocean was not a place where a small boat could safely wait around for very long. The lifeboat offered an immediate escape. If the danger had passed, the plan could have been simple as returning to the vessel. There is a theory that the lifeboat may have initially remained connected to the Mary Celeste by a line that would have allowed the group to stay close while keeping a safe distance from the ship. If so, the decision would have made considerably more sense. Briggs wasn't necessarily abandoning his ship, he may have believed he was stepping away from it for a short time. The trouble is that a plan like this depends on everything going exactly as expected. A change in the wind could increase the distance between the two vessels. Heavy seas could make it impossible to maintain the connection. The line itself could just break. And once the lifeboat was separated from the Mary Celeste, there would have been no easy way back. The larger ship had a mast, sails, and enough structure to continue moving through the ocean. The lifeboat had none of those advantages. A separation of only a few hundred meters could have become a permanent one. This may explain the strangest part of the entire story. The people aboard the Mary Celeste may have never intended to disappear. They may have expected to return. Instead, the ship moved away from them. Winds and currents carried the vessel across the Atlantic, where the small lifeboat followed a different path. From the perspective of those in the boat, the Mary Celeste would have gradually become smaller. Eventually it would have disappeared over the horizon. At that point the group would have been stranded, and their situation would have become desperate. They were somewhere in the Atlantic with limited supplies, no radio, and no reliable way to communicate with passing ships. The Mary Celeste, meanwhile, was still floating. It continued its journey without anyone at the helm. Days later, the crew of Del Grata saw the vessel. They saw a ship that had effectively become a message in a bottle. Everything necessary to understand the disappearance was inside of it, but the people that could explain those clues were gone. The mystery attracted suspicion almost immediately. One possibility was piracy. The Atlantic was dangerous and attacks on the merchant vessels were not unheard of, but the evidence doesn't fit particularly well. The cargo was still aboard. The personal belongings of the missing people had been left behind. There was no convincing evidence of a violent struggle. Another possibility was murder. Perhaps the crew had turned against the captain. Perhaps someone had killed the others and escaped. But again, the physical evidence offers little support. No bodies, no crime scene, no obvious motive. And no explanation for why someone responsible for the disappearance would leave the vessel and its valuable cargo behind. Over time, stranger theories emerged. Some accounts turned to the Mary Celeste into a supernatural story. The ship became known as a ghost vessel, and later retellings added more details that made the disappearance seem more inexplicable. But the facts themselves don't require anything supernatural. A human decision made under pressure may have been enough. The most plausible reconstruction is also the simplest. At some point during the Atlantic crossing, Captain Briggs became concerned that the Mary Celeste was no longer safe. The leaking alcohol barrels had raised many fears of an explosion. Watering entering the hull may have added to those concerns. Briggs made a decision to leave the vessel temporarily, taking his family and crew with him. He may have expected to remain nearby and then returned when the danger passed, but the plan failed. Whether the lifeboat connected to the ship or simply traveling alongside it, something caused the two vessels to separate. The people aboard the smaller boat were left behind, the Mary Celeste survived, and the lifeboat never reappeared. The irony is that the decision that may have been to save lives may have ended up taking all of theirs. The ship continued without them, and the ocean kept the rest of the story.